Do you want to know more about how you can eat for better health and longevity, and how your diet and lifestyle can play a part in chronic disease? Then you're in the right place. I'm Claire Day.
And I'm Daisy Lund, and we are both plant-based doctors with a passion for improving nutritional education. In this podcast, we will bring you all the latest medical evidence on how a plant-based diet can improve your health whilst being kinder to the planet and fairer to the animals that we share it with.
Twice a month, we bring you interviews from experts in the field with a focus on an important topic related to plant-based health, all while sharing recipes and food ideas.
So, welcome to In a Nutshell, the Plant-Based Health Professionals podcast.
This week, we recorded an episode with a real expert in ecology and health, Dr. Tushar Mehta. That interview is coming up, and we hope you'll enjoy listening to Tushar as much as we enjoyed our discussion with him on the interconnectedness of all the social, environmental, and health implications of humans' actions on the earth, particularly with regard to the food system. But Daisy, on another note of interconnectedness, we saw a fantastic film last week, didn't we?
Oh, we did, Claire. We had such a nice evening out watching a new film called I Could Never Go Vegan. And that's a latest vegan documentary by Tom Pickering. And what a fantastic film. I mean, it was just, for me, really emotional in that I felt bits of it made me laugh, bits of it made me cry. And it just covered so many of the aspects of why people feel they can't go vegan, what their concerns are, in a really, just a lovely way to do it. And what did you think of the film?
I thought it was brilliant, and I was so sad that I couldn't get more people along with me, that I really want to see it. And, perhaps that will change. Perhaps there will be some ways that, it will come onto the sort of mainstream channels or something like that. And then it'll be really much easier to push people in the direction of watching it. But I think for a lot of people, sort of a night out to watch a vegan film when they're not that way inclined is just a bridge too far.
Yeah, I agree. I hope Tom does get it on the streaming platforms because, as you say, it's probably something you'd watch at home. And it's one of those films, I think, that could really change hearts and minds. It has the potential. So if you haven't seen it, listeners, and you're interested in going to see it, we would recommend getting to King's College on the evening of the 2nd of May. There's a special screening that the plant-based healthcare professionals are doing with a Q&A with Tom Pickering. So take someone who's interested, maybe someone who's not yet informed of all the topics around veganism, and we hope the film will do some of the work of explaining and shifting people's viewpoint.
In the meantime, here's the excellent Dr. Tushar Mehta.
Okay, so this week we are honoured to welcome Dr. Tushar Mehta to The Nutshell. Tushar is joining us from Ontario in Canada, where he's an expert lecturer in the environmental, ecological, and social aspects of vegan health and nutrition. He is the co-founder of the Plant-Based Data Project, as well as finding time to deliver care in emergency, family, and addiction medicine. So thank you so much for joining us, Tushar.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for all the work that you do.
Welcome, Tushar. I'm going to start by asking you, how did you come to put so much time into thinking about this interconnectedness of society, our environment, and the food system?
I think for me, it stems from a place of social justice initially. Since I was a child, I was very concerned about social justice, well-being, and the suffering of people, really. And because I did see a lot of suffering traveling to places like India as a small child. And over time, this developed into a much broader concern about that included animals, that included the global environment. And thinking about these things day in and day out, realizing that they are all very interconnected and they're different facets of the same issue as far as I'm concerned. The same issue of well-being for the planet, people, animals, and all.
So can you tell us more about what are the basic reasons that plant-based diets have a lower ecological impact? Because we do often hear that animal product consumption has a climate impact, but what are the other impacts aside from climate change that are so critical in this area?
Okay, thank you. What I want to do is answer that question. But even prior to answering that question, I want to provide some details or context in which animal agriculture occurs. So I like to always start looking at a broad picture of what's going on in the earth. Okay. And so, first of all, starting with people. Now, just this past year, we've reached 8 billion people on the planet, and we grow at about 1% per year, population growth in the world. And therefore, we add roughly a billion people to the planet every 10 years. And we're supposed to reach 10 billion people by 2050. Now, amongst that population, more than 4 billion people are considered in poverty. They live under less than $7.50 per day per person in their family. And that's quite a minimal amount. And you may even see that there's 5 or 6 billion poor people, depending on the standard of living that you're looking at as your baseline. But official poverty, it's over 4 billion people that are poor, and almost a billion people, or about a billion people, who are considered in extreme poverty. Okay, and many who are in food insecurity. Now, when it comes to another big way of looking at the earth is the biomass of all life on earth. So if you're looking at the biomass of mammals on earth, humans make up roughly 1/3 of the biomass of mammals on earth. So there are a few thousand species of mammals, but humans alone make up 1/3 of the biomass. And our livestock, cattle and then goats, sheep, and a few others, but mostly cattle, make up about 2/3 of the biomass of animals or mammals on earth. And wild mammals, all those many species, altogether, if you add up all the elephants and mice and giraffes and zebras and leopards and lions, etc., they add up to less than 4% of the biomass of animals on Earth. So we can see how grossly distorted the population of humans and our controlled animals are compared to wild animals. Over the past 50 years, animals that have been tracked by the F and London Zoological Society have roughly been cut in half. Populations that are tracked have been cut in half. So we're rapidly losing our wild animal populations. And during the same time, human and livestock biomass has pretty much doubled. There are about 18,000 species of wild birds in the world, but one single species, chickens, that never existed in nature, but humans have created them, they've bred them into existence, weigh all wild birds, those 18,000 species, by 3 times. So we can see the scale. I want people to understand the radical scale of humans and our livestock compared to wild animals on the earth, and how we dominate this situation. At the same time, over 75% of the land-based environment has been altered by humans. 2/3 of the marine environment. We have devastated wild fish populations in the oceans. 3/4 of all accessible freshwater systems are devoted to crop or livestock use. And our crop production has increased by 300% since 1970. We've cut the world's green, like sort of plant biomass in half by humans, mainly through deforestation. Okay, and we control 1/4 of all green biomass that grows in the world. Agriculture itself occupies about 50% of the non-frozen habitable surface of the earth. And our rates of deforestation and so forth are generally increasing. Sometimes people will say that, hey, we're reforesting a lot of the world, but a lot of that has to be distinguished between reforesting wild forests versus reforesting through plantations, which are again then for human use and not necessarily biodiverse ecosystems. So sometimes people say that, hey, we're reforesting a lot, but within that picture, they're not capturing that which is actually plantation forests. And so I call this ecological genocide, and literally a genocide, because we have this extreme biodiversity loss, rapid extinction rates, and we know that we're in the 5th mass extinction period of the world as well, and this is a big cause of it. Okay, so it's within that context then that we want to look at plant-based versus animal-based consumption as food consumption and the ecological impacts. So prior to talking about sort of climate change and all the different problems with animal agriculture, there's a really important concept people need to know, and that is the feed conversion ratio. And we're all physicians. We know that if we have a child, and that if you're feeding that child 10 grams of protein, it doesn't mean that they add 10 grams of protein to their body. They're using their daily protein intake for a lot of metabolic purposes. And as the individual grows, part of it will be incorporated into their body, into their bones, into other tissues, into muscle mass, etc. But much of it is also utilized for energy and different metabolic purposes as well. And so when we feed an animal, to grow an animal, to slaughter that animal or get animal products from the animal, it's not like you feed them 1 kilogram of protein and then you get 1 kilogram of consumable protein out of the animal, or you feed them X amount of calories and you get that same amount of calories back. What happens is you have a feed conversion ratio. So if we're feeding chickens protein, they are the most efficient animal if done in the most extremely perfect way. And you can have a remarkable 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 protein conversion ratio, meaning that we can feed a chicken 3 or 4 kilograms of protein in their feed. And by the end, when that chicken is slaughtered, about 1/3 or 1/4 of that protein fed to the animal becomes available back in terms of somebody else to consume. So that means we've wasted 2/3 or 3/4 of the protein that went to feed that animal. If somebody had directly consumed that protein, it's all bioavailable to the humans, right? But there's a wastage there of protein because of the feed conversion ratio. We can get these remarkably high feed conversion ratios. For example, humans don't have that kind of a feed conversion ratio. They're achieved because of the genetic modification of these animals in the first place. They are bred, and breeding is a form of genetic modification. They're bred to become so efficient, to grow so abnormally large and huge, so fast, that they're very distorted animals. Under the conditions of intense factory farming, restriction of movement so they're not going around burning calories, given antibiotics, heating up the cages, leaving the lights on, and so forth, which activates various factors that makes them grow faster as well. And other practices that together get these remarkable feed conversion ratios. Now, that is not including the fact that many of these chickens get sick and then die off, and you have all kinds of pandemics that spread amongst animals, and then thousands and millions or hundreds of millions of them are culled every year. So that takes away from their efficiency. And that is also probably mostly in westernized countries where you have extreme, rigorous conditions in which they are bred and raised, and you quickly lose these type of efficiencies in any places where you don't have those extreme efficiencies in place. The feed conversion ratio can also be 3-to-1 for insects. People tout insects as some ecological option, but a lot of the good available evidence shows that when you grow them in mass conditions, you have to feed high quality feed, and you get probably a 3-to-1 conversion ratio at max. Same with the most efficient fish in aquaculture. And other animals, such as pigs, maybe give you a 6-to-8 ratio of feed conversion for protein, and maybe 10-to-18 for beef. And milk and eggs are about equivalent to chicken feed conversion ratios as well, like 3 kilograms in to 1 kilogram out of feed conversion ratio. So this is important to know because this informs us as to how much you have to feed an animal to get how much back from the animal. And that will determine how many crops go towards animals, how much land is used for animals, how much water is used for animals, etc., to create their feed. And indirectly, we're consuming corn and soybeans and other feed through the animal, and therefore losing this efficiency. And this far exceeds food waste. And especially when animal products are wasted as food, there's a disproportionate environmental impact when animal products are actually wasted as food waste. Okay, so I think that's a really key concept, and then we can sort of see why animals have a really enormous ecological impact. It's because it takes more land, water, more soil, more pesticides, more antibiotics, more fertilizers. If we're going to grow crops to feed animals, to then feed humans. 50% of the world's crops are fed to animals to then feed back to humans. And the data on this is kind of old and not very good. It's an area which there hasn't been as much study as there should be. And partly some of those reasons may be because there's a bias against studying these things, right? We live in a culture that consumes animals, and proportionately there's less funding and less interest in studying these issues in detail. But that's an area where we would love to get some updated numbers, because the numbers are probably worse as global animal agriculture has expanded disproportionately. In terms of terrestrial livestock, so livestock on land, we slaughter about 80 billion animals per year, mostly chickens, and that's about 2,000 animals per second. And we consider monogastric animals, animals with one stomach, as chickens, pigs, and other birds that people consume. And then there's ruminants, which include cattle, goats, buffalo, sheep. They have a rumination process, and they create methane in their rumen from the digestive process. And so there's a high amount of methane that comes from the ruminant animals. And that goes back then to climate change, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So when we talk about 75% of the non-frozen surface of the earth is altered by humans, 50 of the non-frozen earth is for agriculture, 30% of the non-frozen surface of the earth approximately is for ruminant agriculture, so creating feed or pasture and grazing animals. Okay, so mainly for grazing, which returns only a very, very tiny amount of global protein back for consumption and for human consumption. And about 15% of the non-frozen surface of the earth is used for crop production, but half of all crops goes to animals. And therefore about 7% of the global earth surface is used to create food that directly humans consume. Out of that, that includes, apples and oranges and lettuce and celery and potatoes and all kinds of stuff. But the actual main protein foods that humans consume, which are grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes, it's a smaller proportion than 7%. So with that small proportion of the Earth's surface that grows food for direct human consumption, let's roughly call it half of that 7% used for human food consumption. I'm saying roughly 7% there, right? That's so maybe 3, 4, 5% of the Earth's surface is used for protein foods that humans consume. That creates 60% of global human protein consumption, a little bit more than 60%. Whereas almost 40% of the Earth's surface, which is used then to feed animals to then feed back to humans, creates less than 40% of global protein. So we can see the vast efficiency differences here. And if we were to eat, let's say 100% plant-based, theoretically, we would save a massive proportion of the Earth's surface, which is now being used for animal agriculture, either to grow crops to feed animals or to feed animals in pastures and so forth. And then we'll get into this whole idea of grazing and regenerative grazing a little bit more, which is often touted as ecological, and show why it's not ecological. But that's the fundamental things. Animal agriculture is therefore the number one cause of deforestation on the planet, either by causing new deforestation, or it's already existed in place for, let's say, decades, or 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. But prior to that, it was a forest. So in terms of occupied land or new deforestation, it is the number one cause. And it's also the number one cause for loss of wetlands, because wetlands have often been drained to create pastures. Now, this may have happened historically, but prior to some of these traditional grazing lands, they were wetlands. And the number one probably biodiversity impact on the surface of the earth, simply because it uses the most amount of land altogether. And, one of the biggest uses of pesticides, because half of crops which do use pesticides go towards animal feed. And the list goes on in terms of soil erosion from crop agriculture, which goes to feed animals, but also soil erosion from grazing and desertification from grazing itself, and other processes. So I consider animal agriculture as one of the top 3 impacts on the planet. It's on the scale of global fossil fuel use. It's on the scale of the total material economy of all mining and extraction and everything else that humans do in terms of its impact on the earth. And I forgot to mention there about water in terms of water use for crops and for animals, but also the pollution of water by animal feces that run off into water systems, causing eutrophication and water pollution, and also soil erosion that ends up in waterways as well. So it's a massive global impact. And I think those things we want to sort of keep in our mind as connected things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all really need to hold that fact in our heads about the weight of chickens versus wild birds, because that's a really powerful fact, especially for bird watchers. The ecological reasons are clear, but how do you think we can really sell the benefit of plant proteins to individuals who are perhaps saying, well, you're just telling me about the conversion rate of how many crops that a cow has to eat to make a kilo of beef. So for me, eating an animal is a really efficient way of getting protein, and I don't think I want to eat the equivalent in crop to get that.
So from the environmental point of view, there is a massive efficiency difference. And obviously, depending on the type of animal product that people consume, the efficiency is greatly varied. For example, yes, chickens are more efficient compared to eating, let's say, beef. However, still far less efficient compared to eating the most efficient plant proteins. And the comparison has to be fair. You can't compare chickens to like lettuce and say what's more efficient in terms of protein. You have to say, okay, this is the most efficient form of animal protein. Let's compare that to the most efficient or some of the most efficient forms of plant protein. So soybeans or certain legumes would be the equivalent.
Okay, we wanted to talk a bit about the different views on sustainable food systems, because obviously we're hearing one view of what a sustainable food system is here, and hopefully the right one. And one of the things that strikes me is we're in a world where we've got so much access to data, so much access to journals and studies that have been done. How do you think we've ended up with so many different views on what is a sustainable food system?
Well, it's not an accident. And I think that, and it didn't just come about randomly, it's been a deliberate thing. When we look at large industries, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, the smoking industry, which I think is very important here, tobacco, and other large industries, they create a lot of their own narratives and misinformation and disinformation, and are very well connected to mass media and now social media, and propagate these things everywhere. My colleague at Plant Based Data, Nicholas Carter, who you know of, recently published a disinformation report with an organization called Freedom Food Alliance. And I would encourage all readers to go to that report and to see all the different ways in which, or many of the different ways in which animal agriculture has used the same playbook or similar playbooks as the fossil fuel industry and tobacco industry, which was kind of the progenitor of these methods in a lot of ways, and what other industries also do in order to create multiple different narratives that sound great or appeal to different people. And in many cases, fund their own research as well. When it comes to nutrition research and environment research, the animal agriculture industry, which is highly concentrated, creates a lot of their own research, funds a lot of their own research and researchers. And as we know as physicians as well, the pharmaceutical industry does this too. When you see our pharmaceutical industries do research on drugs that they've invented, et cetera, pretty much in the vast majority of cases, they're going to show their products being beneficial. Whereas when you have independent research not funded by industry, it shows a very different picture of those same medications in many cases. So this is a problem everywhere, but we have to look at it scientifically. And so this is what animal agriculture is also doing, funding research. In the past, they would always say that, oh, this study was funded by the National Cattlemen's Association or the Egg Board or so forth. But increasingly, as they know that people look at the funding source and criticize that, they're finding ways to also obscure the funding sources for a lot of their work as well. In many cases, they fund researchers, they fund entire departments of universities or universities themselves. So there's a lot going on here in terms of the studies that they fund. other biases that they have as well. They're vertically integrated, so they may create studies and then they'll highly publicize them throughout the media, and there's all kinds of things there. So I think it's beyond the scope of our topic here, but I think we should all be aware that industry spends hundreds of millions of dollars advertising all these things. They'll come up with some study about regenerative grazing, and then the next thing you know, fast food chains like McDonald's or A&W, Burger King will then be promoting their products as having these qualities. But you have to look at the research itself, and we want to look at the methodology. And if we're talking about regenerative grazing, one of the major things is this. When they do studies about regenerative grazing, so-called regenerative grazing, what they're doing is looking at really bad forms of crop production or really bad forms of grazing, and they compare that to regenerative grazing. And they say that, okay, this style of so-called regenerative grazing or multi-paddock grazing or rotational grazing, different terms that they use, increased soil biodiversity or had some benefits relative to this other practice that pre-existed on that land. Okay. And we know as physicians as well, when you do a study on medications or a treatment or diagnostic test or something like that, you're comparing that new test or that new medication to an old medication or to a placebo. You're always saying that it's beneficial or worse compared to something else, right? You're never looking at it by its own. That's what also happens in these studies. Well, what they're not doing is they're not comparing that regenerative grazing study, they're not comparing it to the best forms of plant-based agriculture. That's what's not being done. And if they did compare it to the best forms of plant-based agriculture, then what you would find is that, okay, they used this much land to create this much protein. Well, if you compared it to the best form of plant-based agriculture, you'd only need this much land to create that much protein. And that entire saved land could then be renaturalized or used for some other purpose, but hopefully in most of the cases, renaturalized, rewilded, which is also a process. It's not necessarily always the same pathway or easy, but it could be rewilded as best as possible. And that would be best thing ever for biodiversity, for carbon storage into the soil, but also the root systems, the biomass of the plants, the forest detritus, restoring wetlands, etc. There's been nothing better than actually attempting to rewild, saving the land and rewilding it. And I think that is the thing that they're not comparing to when they're doing these things. And also excluding the fact that when people graze animals, as opposed to, let's say, intensively farming them, those animals will take greater amounts of feed, take a longer time to reach slaughter weight. They'll be less efficient. They create more methane if they are ruminant animals that are grazed. So you actually have increased amounts of methane, increased land use, increased water use. So you may tweak some areas to be better, but then other areas you're going to be worse off because there's one study showing it takes 70% to 250% more land to do regenerative grazing compared to conventional cattle production. So you might have some benefits, but then you use more land, which is by itself a disaster. And so if you wanted to have a net benefit, you'd want to greatly reduce the animal product consumption if you're going to use a better practice. And that's, those things are not discussed. So there's a lot of ways in which misinformation is created, and you're leaving out key information in the process of promoting regenerative grazing, etc.
So when we hear this term, regenerative agriculture, and it's touted as a new paradigm, a new way of doing agriculture, does it ever not use animals, or is it always part of a more complex animal-based, livestock-based system?
I think that the word regenerative gets touted for all kinds of things. And there's the UK-based organization from Oxford Table Debates, and they have some publications where they try to define regenerative. And yes, there are regenerative practices which can be applied to plant-based agriculture as well. So they talk about things like regenerative and agroecology, and what does that mean? It means a lot of things like using soil conservation methods, adding ways to integrate some biodiversity with the raising of animals or the production of crops, ways of using less water, ways of using less fertilizers and then having less nitrogen pollution, ways of decreasing eutrophication, and so forth. So there's all kinds of sets of practices that are applied to this term, which can, of course, be applied to plant-based agriculture. And then there are even broader concepts, which they talk about agroecology and many different terms and definitions that go into there. Not every regenerative farm is going to use every single method there. They're going to use the ones that they feel are most expedient and easy to use and so forth. So definitely there is a lot of space in terms of plant agriculture to be further optimized. And when it comes to plant agriculture, of course, we want to optimize that. And by doing so, we can have more carbon sequestration in the soil of plant-based agriculture as well, and integrate more biodiversity in the croplands that we use for plant agriculture, improve human rights across the board, because there are human rights abuses in plant agriculture as well as animal agriculture, although those in animal agriculture, I think, far exceed the problems in plant-based agriculture, but both have these problems. And there are some crops, for example, avocados coming from certain parts of the world, especially certain parts of Mexico, cacao production, and palm oil, that include violence against humans and violence against nature as well in our mass production systems, and simply cannot sustain 8 billion people wanting to consume these products at the scale that we do. So even when it comes to plant-based agriculture, there are some problematic foods that we would definitely want to reduce, avoid, improve on. But let's say by reducing drastically animal agriculture, you can scale up plant-based agriculture. And by using a little bit extra land, you can employ much more human-friendly and eco-friendly practices, even though they might be slightly less efficient than the most intensive forms of plant-based agriculture. Since they take such little land in comparison, we can employ as much of those techniques as possible, noting that it's always going to be a challenging thing to feed 10 billion people on the planet as well.
So, I mean, on that note, and if we discount the animal welfare aspects, is it fair to say that moving to foods from pigs and chickens is actually going to be more eco-friendly than eating beef?
In some ways, the answer is yes. So there will be better feed conversion ratios. And overall, chickens, pigs, monogastric animals are going to use far smaller amounts of land, water, and feed in comparison. They also do not produce as much methane, so less greenhouse gas emission created. However, at the same time, the major trade-off is that these animals have higher pandemic risk because they generally entail even higher amounts of animals that are confined to very small places, or even if the spaces are somewhat larger than the worst practices, there's still a lot of animals in relatively small spaces, and by doing so, these animals are spreading viruses amongst each other, and those viruses undergo rapid mutations that they spread from one animal to another, and different animals are co-infected with multiple different strains of virus that then share the genetic materials, and we are constantly generating new forms of viruses. And a lot of people aren't aware that many of the worst viruses that have affected humans, such as smallpox, measles, and others that have killed literally millions and millions of people throughout history, came from animal agriculture, earlier forms of animal agriculture, which were more traditional, but still had animals together in places where they wouldn't have otherwise been in nature. And over the centuries created these viruses. But now that we have larger scale farms with millions of animals together, we are creating these new viruses at faster rates. So switching to these type of animals exposes us to a much higher pandemic risk. And that's one of the major trade-offs there. There are other problems with these animals as well. The amount of fecal matter that is produced by these animals going into different lagoons. They've made these huge manure lagoons from pig farms and so forth, that running off into water or being sprayed into fields, being located near poor communities, indigenous communities, communities of color and racialized people, and having terrible impacts on those people. So there's all kinds of problems with these forms of agriculture. So it's not to say that they're a slam dunk ecologically better compared to beef. They have a reduced footprint in certain ways, but still have a gigantic footprint. And again, switching from that to plant-based agriculture, optimized plant-based proteins, you're going to save a lot of land. And we have to keep in mind the pandemics as well. Cattle and ruminants also pose a pandemic risk, but somewhat less than these animals. But again, not zero.
And then, of course, we've had COVID, and lots of theories and assertions about how that was linked to zoonotic disease. Do you think that now we've had that there's been some learning such that our global risk of another pandemic is getting better in some way?
I think it's getting worse. So in the early 2000s, we probably all remember the first SARS epidemic that came out, right? After that time, there was tremendous interest in the academic world about zoonotic disease coming from animal agriculture, and you'll see a lot of publications. So if you go to plant-based data and you scroll down to there's a zoonotic disease section there. We have a summary of best articles, as well as a library there of articles where we have a few hundred articles, as well as a COVID section. And so there's a tremendous amount of research was done since that time to learn about zoonotic disease that comes from animal agriculture. So we've learned a lot in the academic world. There is a lot of very good evidence that I think shows that COVID-19 did come from animal agriculture. And even if there was some lab theory or something like that, it still went through the wet market probably to mutate further to then infect humans as well. Okay. But it probably just came from the wet markets itself. And that is a form of zoonotic disease. And I don't think that we've learned that much. I think that animal agriculture is just trying to make these measures to show that they're aware of the issue in some cases, but by and large, the public is not aware. And so they haven't even tried to create a lot of narratives around this anyways, about biosecurity and so forth. And I think far too few people are aware of the pandemic risk that comes from animal agriculture. And as animal agriculture expands, there is increased risk of these zoonotic diseases. Over the past few years, we see these zoonotic diseases wiping out over and over again different populations of farmed animals. And you hear about different parts of the world, oh, they had to kill this many hundreds of thousands or millions of chickens or other animals that were infected by some disease, which was a zoonotic disease that propagated amongst those animals. A certain percentage of those diseases will eventually impact humans in a very bad way. We get some small infections here and there of some type of swine flu or bird flu that affects humans. We don't know when the next pandemic will come, but it can be much worse than COVID-19. And it's going to happen if we keep doing this. What's also happening is that these viruses go and affect wild populations of animals. And then you have wild populations of animals around the world, birds and other animals, that then are affected and die from zoonotic disease that came from factory farms. So this is another way that animal agriculture has a direct impact on wild animal populations and biodiversity.
Tushar, can I ask a little bit about fish, the ecological impacts of consuming fish? Because that's sometimes promoted as a climate-friendly option.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So what happens in the environmental space is that we're disproportionately focused on climate and climate change alone, and ignore other very important environmental parameters, such as biodiversity, which I think should be our number one concern, land use, water pollution, human impacts, etc. And industry purposely also does this, promote everything about climate, because then it can create some kind of solution or fake solution or partial solution to reduce emissions, or at least look like they're reducing emissions, and ignore all the other consequences of that action. For example, as I mentioned, regenerative grazing may emit a little bit less carbon, or say that you do even, or carbon equivalents, but you end up using more land, right? that's a very bad trade-off, or increased pandemic risk. In the case of fish, yeah, fish do not create a lot of greenhouse gases. Fish farming may not create a lot of greenhouse gases in and of itself. But what it is doing is wiping out ecosystems and in the ocean. So people consume between 1 to 3 trillion fish per year, and that amounts to between 30,000 and 90,000 fish per second that we are taking out of the ocean. And essentially, we're wiping out all fish populations, or most fish populations, from the oceans, because we have these massive trawlers that do bottom trawling or other types of fishing and take out tens of millions of fish from the ocean at a time, at all times, 24 hours a day, all over the oceans, to feed this population of 8 billion people, the proportion of that consumes fish. Again, let's think of the biomass of humans versus all wild animals to see how big a footprint that we are on this world in terms of just what we eat. And so we're wiping out fish from the oceans. Now, as we're wiping out all kinds of fish, people are saying, oh, well, then we'll do fish farming or aquaculture, because then we don't have to capture these wild fish that are being wiped out. But the primary feed for aquaculture are other wild fish that are not consumed by humans. So there's all kinds of fish that humans don't consume. So they wipe out those from the ocean and feed them to the farmed fish. And so then you're wiping out those populations more and more. And so there's a big boom in aquaculture, but now we started wiping out these other trophic levels of fish in the entire food web of the ocean and ecosystems of the ocean. And they're getting wiped out. And now people are looking for alternative types of feed that they can then grow crops to feed certain fish or grow insects to feed certain fish. But if they're growing insects to feed certain fish, again, there's feed conversion ratio issues and all kinds of ecological issues that will be associated with that as well. And so you're always losing efficiencies. But these aquacultures, this massive aquaculture, has its own devastating footprint. There's so much waste created from these fish that goes on into the ocean as well and affects the ocean ecosystems. There's diseases that spread amongst these fish, which then spread to wild fish and kill off wild fish. There are fish that escape from these aquaculture systems as well, and they then interbreed with wild fish, but their offspring have less chance of survival in the wild. So that's a way that you're, again, losing fish populations in the wild. And there's all kinds of bycatch and everything like that that happens with the fishing industry, and I haven't even got into, as well as a major source of plastic pollution, because all the nets and everything that are used in the fishing industry, they have a limited lifespan. And there's thousands and millions of tons of fishing nets that are used globally on a yearly basis. And it's very expensive to take these old nets and then wrap them up back onto your ship and then take them to land and then find a place to dispose of them. That's a very long, arduous, and expensive process. So what generally happens, they just cut the nets and leave them in the ocean. And that makes a plastic pollution in the ocean that continues to entangle and ensnare and kill off wildlife, as well as eventually breaking down into all kinds of plastic garbage. And the biggest killer of whales actually is the fishing industry, because they get entangled into all types of lobster traps and fishing nets, and we're wiping out whales from the ocean. And that's the biggest loss of, and seabirds and all kinds of other animals is the fishing industry. Seabirds, there may be other impacts too, but definitely whales, it's the biggest problem for whales. So when people look at fishing from the single narrow lens of climate change, which is often done, it looks better. But when you look at the real biodiversity impact of the fishing industry, it's devastating.
Yeah, it really is, isn't it? And I guess with all these facts and information you're giving us, it can feel a bit gloomy. I suppose my question would be, what would the world look like if we were just to consume less animals? If we were to shift to a plant-based diet, what would the outcome be?
So I guess we're talking about solutions here, right? We're talking about what would we want to do to make a better world. And the solutions that are often promoted are, let's say, more intensive animal agriculture, or more, so that would be more efficient. That the UN, FAO sometimes promotes that. Let's get more intensive, more efficient. But that has definite problems with it in terms of pandemics, and you have relative efficiency where have a smaller footprint per animal, but now you want more animals. So this is a big problem in environmental discussions where we talk about relative efficiencies, something called the Jevons paradox. You have a slightly higher efficiency, but then you're expanding the entire system. So at the end of the day, you're going to be worse, right? And so some people want more intensive, and some people want more expansive. They say, oh, we should bring all these animals back into pasture and so forth. Well, in that case, you'll have to cut down every single forest on Earth to produce the same amount of meat that you want right now. Even if you cut down every single forest on Earth and turn it all into pasture land, you probably wouldn't be able to create as much animal protein as you did right now. So that's not a solution of having some kind of eco meat. But if we do go plant-based, okay, and use good plant-based agriculture, we can basically take the entire amount of the Earth's surface that we use for agriculture to feed humans, somewhere between 40 and 50%, noting that part of our agriculture is used, let's say, for clothing production, like cotton or biofuels and so forth as well. And these things also need to be scaled back. But take it, let's say 45% of the Earth's surface used for feeding humans, you'd probably be able to feed humans with then less than 15% of the Earth's surface. In fact, there's good stats showing that if you just converted the land used to feed animals, like grow crops to feed animals, you could feed an additional 4 billion people with that amount of land already. So certainly we can grow a lot more food on a far smaller surface area of the land. And then what we'd want to do is we would want to rewild that large amount of land. And on the one hand, we want to optimize our crop production, our plant food production to be ecological, to be so-called regenerative. You incorporate regenerative principles, social justice principles, agroecology principles. We want to incorporate all of these things, veganic principles. Also, not to have it all controlled, let's say, by big industry, but have lots and lots of diverse and small players to have this diverse beauty in our plant-based food system, as well as restore a lot of the traditional types of crops and that people grew over the centuries that then have resilience to various types of diseases and all kinds of stuff like that. Now, within that space, there's also going to be some GMO, okay? But we can find a balance between these things. We want to try and optimize to feed 8, 10 billion people. And then that vast amount of other land can be rewilded. And we could find the best practices for different regions and different ecosystems of the world to try and rewild these things, allow rewilding or promote rewilding, sometimes actively, sometimes passively, and do research around best practices as well. And thereby vastly improve biodiversity in this world and try to reverse this sixth mass extinction that's going on. With wetlands restoration and forest restoration, we can sequester enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, once it's created, stays in the atmosphere for centuries. So by doing this, we could very rapidly try to sequester a lot of carbon in the soil, but not just soil, in the root systems, in forest detritus, and in the plant mass that grows itself. Then we would have a lot less methane production as well. So, and methane, being a short-lived climate gas, could fall quite rapidly and would really very quickly help us stay below 1.5 degree temperature rise as well. So this in itself provides many, many benefits that can be seen within 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, within very short timescales. At the same time, we'd be using less water. We'd have less water eutrophication, so freshwater systems and biodiversity in freshwater ecosystems would be improved, and also the oceans as well, which are literally dying from fishing industry and aquaculture as well. So there'll be very rapid benefits from doing this at the same time as having hopefully a vibrant, beautiful, plant-based food systems that people can share around the globe. And this is not to say that there are going to be some people who may increase plant-based consumption in a stepwise fashion at different rates than other people. And maybe there are some small populations on the earth that are dependent on animal agriculture, some indigenous people in certain places, etc. Fine. But that's going to be a small number of people. And of course, we're not trying to force plant-based foods on the most vulnerable people in remote areas and so forth. But we're trying to find solutions for the majority of people who can realistically have access to really good quality plant-based foods.
We wanted to ask you actually about the issue with regards people with nutrient shortages, for example, areas of the world where that there is a lot of social inequality. We were quite surprised when we were following the COP28 conference end of last year that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's chief economist suggested that we should intensify meat production as a way to sort of help with the nutrient shortages in various parts of the world. And he mentions countries like Denmark, who are very good at that sort of meat production, to be the solution to this. It just felt a bit counterintuitive, but we were wondering what your thoughts were.
So I do some work in developing countries. I used to work in a remote area, not too remote, but like a rural area in India, where my family comes from. And I volunteered at a hospital there for about 10 years. Every January, I'd work with rural populations, many of who are within that global poor, making less than $2 a day per person in their family. And currently I do some work in Haiti. So I'm very, very sensitive to the needs of people in the global south, and especially in poor communities. And of course, here too, in places like Canada. And definitely, if somebody is a poor person in some parts of the world, they want to get the nutrients that they can get to optimize their health and the health of their families in any manner possible. They're not necessarily thinking about biodiversity or should I eat plant-based because it's better for the environment. Their primary concern is going to be getting the food that they need for their own health optimization, which is not to say they don't think about these things, because some people do. We got to give them credit for that as well. People are intelligent, and some people think of these things, but they don't have a lot of options. So definitely, if you have people who are food insecure and have nutrient deficiencies and don't get enough food, you could give them animal products which contain some of the nutrients that could help them, that they may be lower in those nutrients, including B12, zinc, vitamin A, calcium, and maybe a few other nutrients. You could do that. But in most cases, the places where these people already exist aren't necessarily going to sustain expansive animal agriculture practices. If they do, they will probably do so at a great environmental cost. And many of these places are already severely affected by environmental issues, including a heavy toll of animal agriculture. I come from an area of India that demonstrates that. And so the best traditional practices are still having an enormous impact. Simply the population of humans is so large compared to what it was, let's say, thousands of years ago. And okay, so their traditional practices are going to have an impact. Then the United Nations oftentimes is going to say that, oh, let's have intensive animal agriculture in those places or for those places. That means you're going to have a place like Denmark or other places exporting food to these food insecure areas. So it's not grown locally and they don't have food sovereignty or food security there through their own production, food production. Or you're going to try to employ those techniques in the area where those people live. Try to have some form of intensive animal agriculture where they live, but then they will be importing feed. So either way, there's going to be external inputs that are not from that land, or even optimizing their own animal agricultural practices. In most cases, it's just going to have even an increasing ecological toll in those places where they already are. So certainly you can improve some nutrient parameters by providing animal foods, but what could also be done, and what the United Nations isn't saying, is that you can also try to find optimized plant options, plant-based options. What are the best plant-based proteins and other foods that can be grown by these people through their own traditional methods, through methods that are helped by modern technology, and sometimes through certain imports as well. So let's say in the area of India where I come from, most of it has been deforested, and there's been all kinds of impacts of animal agriculture and humans being in that environment. Even though they maximally, I believe, employ regenerative practices, practices that they've been using, I think, for decades, centuries, prior to some European or American coining the term regenerative agriculture. If you look and study the practices used in the place of India where I come from, the area of Kutch, and probably many places in India and around the world, people have created all kinds of optimal practices around animal agriculture. But as populations have increased and time has gone, there has, in most cases, been vast environmental impact just because of that. But now in those same areas, which are semi-arid, they're using lots of modern technologies to grow all kinds of crops there for direct human consumption and for animal feed as well. So by employing those things, growing more plant proteins, and maybe doing something like introducing foods that can work in those cultural contexts, like soy milk that is fortified with calcium and vitamin B12. So, for example, soy milk is it would be like a plant-based version of a food that is normally consumed from animals, right? And as such, I think that soy milk is excellent because it has excellent nutrition profile. At the same time, we can talk about fortified soy milk being something that works in many different cultural foods. My wedding in India, we use soy milk in all the dishes that would normally contain dairy milk, and it worked really well. And being accessible in so many places in the world because it's so efficient to produce, transport, etc. So having a plant-based version of a traditional food that was animal-based can be a really good thing. And in India, I can say that there's lots of plant-based meat companies coming up. And sometimes I've tried to speak to them about, okay, how can you improve your nutritional profile? Reduce the sodium, reduce saturated fats, use best practices. And then you can see that some of these transition plant-based meats could have a low ecological impact and be nutritionally optimized if you avoid high sodium and saturated fats in your product. Okay, and so we should be mindful that these types of meat replacements, which will help people transition from cultures where meat is consumed, then they can be really good options. And it's not just all about precision fermentation and lab-grown meat, which seems to be all the rage, but we're undervaluing plant-based meats, oftentimes criticizing them all in one basket, saying that they're all bad, as opposed to looking at them on a case-by-case basis to see which ones of them are the most sustainable and use the best nutritional practices as well. There are, I think, huge opportunities for optimal plant-based foods in the global south, the global north, and other places, but in food insecure places for sure, that could fill these nutrition deficits with a far less ecological impact, probably lesser expense as well, and still be culturally sensitive and all kinds of things. And I think that the United Nations is not doing this. And another thing is that the United Nations is getting increasingly influenced by animal agriculture, and we're going to be writing a paper about this as well.
Interesting. We look forward to reading that. Can you tell us your views on GM foods?
Right. Yeah. So, as I alluded before, when we've been breeding animals into the type of domesticated animals we have right now, that is a form of genetic modification that's happened over long periods, but it accelerated over the past few decades as we became really good at breeding animals. And most people don't know that cow and cattle are not natural animals on the earth. They never existed. They were bred into existence from another animal called an urok, which now humans have hunted into extinction. Chickens never existed in the world. They were bred into existence from the red jungle fowl, but they're not a natural animal. And same with a lot of the plant foods that we eat. They never existed. Broccoli and so many different types of plant foods never ever existed. Some older version of these foods existed, but we've bred them into existence. And that is a form of genetic modification. Now we have new technologies for direct gene modification as well. And I believe that when you're feeding 10 billion people on the planet, it's going to be a difficult problem in many respects. Growing enough food, growing enough nutrients, distributing them, social justice, equity, economic systems are all at play here. And some technology is going to be used. I don't think we're going to completely avoid pesticides or genetic modification. The question is, what is the genetic modification and how will it be used in the real world? So if we're genetically modifying all kinds of crops to have pesticide resistance so that we can use huge amounts of Roundup or glyphosate on those crops, which will then pollute the environment in terrible ways, I don't think that's a great use of genetic modification. And there are probably alternatives that we could use instead. However, if we're having some genetic modification to an existing crop or to heirloom crops or further crossbreeding heirloom crops in a manner that we've done over the centuries anyways, and creating a little bit of drought tolerance or creating more vitamin A in a plant food that otherwise wasn't there that meets vitamin A needs better, or other things like that, increasing the protein content of certain types of grains or legumes or whatever to meet protein needs. That's not necessarily a bad thing in every case, right? So we have to be mindful of the reason why and how it will be implemented in the real world and what the consequences might be. And has to sort of go on a case by case basis. We have to be rational about it rather than putting everything in the same basket and saying it's all good or all bad.
And on that same note, in terms of the advances in food production, can you tell us a little bit about your views on lab meat or precision fermentation, for example?
Yeah, I think these are very, very interesting technologies that are coming up. So I'm glad you distinguished precision fermentation from lab grown meat. And there's going to be multiple different iterations of these types of technologies. It seems that they're going to play a role. I think for many people who don't want to have such types of food, they don't have to consume them. But for some foods, this can be a very efficient thing. For example, right now there's whey protein that you can have for protein powders for athletes and people who use protein powders, or for nutritional shakes or supplements. Whey protein is often utilized. And if you can make whey protein in a far more efficient manner as compared to dairy, then it's an ecological win. And ultimately, you got the same protein. And we're eating this stuff anyways, right? So it's not necessarily a bad thing. We have to then look at the nutritional impacts of consuming whey protein compared to, let's say, consuming soy protein isolate or something like that, or hemp protein or other things in terms of nutrition and ecological parameters. But if it's far more efficient than the same thing from animals, then it's going to be a win. And I think these things will get more efficient as time goes on. So precision fermentation to create certain types of proteins or certain types of fats, etc. We'll have to see the technical details when they arise. So the technical details in terms of the inputs to produce these and the outputs in terms of, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, noting that different products will be different and they will become more efficient over time as well. But probably overall, they're going to be far more efficient than producing animals to get the meat. And they could have nutritional advantages as well, because you may be able to say, for example, cut the amount of cholesterol and saturated fat to much lower levels by, tweaking the type of the product that you have. You'll be able to control those things. So I'm not suggesting that everybody should consume these things, but this will provide a much better alternative for many people who just really want to eat meat because they like the meat. And I know people like that. So for some people, it could be an advantage. And it may be an advantage also for people in other parts of the world too. We just don't know. But the implementation is going to matter here. If, for example, large companies take over the food space more and more, and you have less diversity in terms of food producers and disproportionate political control, et cetera, by big producers that are very centralized, that's not going to be a great thing. Now, if you look at the meat industry, it's already like that, as well as certain crops. For example, I just learned recently that maybe peanut butter is also a very monopolized space in North America. Same with certain crops like avocados or chocolate and palm oil that are concentrated or come from that have bad impacts. Okay. So maybe even precision fermentation will replace the deforestation for some things like palm oil. So there could be many uses, but we also have to look at the social aspects, the economic aspects, the political aspects, and the concentration of power and things like that as well, so that it's done in a socially just way as possible.
Tushar, you've given us so much information and food for thought, and I've already been on your website, Plant-Based Data Project. I'd recommend all the listeners go and check it out as well. It's got a wealth of information on there. Could I ask, how do you make sure that you're promoting evidence and not just opinions for the critical readers amongst us?
I think that's a really important question. I think we do our best. Our belief is that the more I look at the evidence around plant-based foods compared to animal agriculture, the evidence speaks for itself. And keeping in mind just the biophysical realities of things like feed conversion ratio, or how much land and water and products does it take to grow an animal versus to grow a plant-based food. And you look at those biophysical realities and you look at the research around these things, and you get consistent pattern over and over again supporting the fact that it's far more efficient for the environment, far more environmentally friendly to eat plants, especially here thinking about the best practices around plant food production. And that pattern keeps reemerging. So just looking at the evidence over and over again that keeps being published in paper after paper after paper, looking at the issue from different angles, just keeps reinforcing this. And I don't think it's something that needs to be exaggerated, but I think it needs to be looked at in detail realistically. I think that if I were to exaggerate benefits and be biased in this issue, people are going to point out any exaggeration that I make, and you're just going to lose credibility. So I think we have that in mind. So we want to interpret the evidence in the best way that we can. Furthermore, we have no funding from any plant-based industry sources. We have very tiny amounts of funding, and we're mostly all volunteer anyways. And so I think that's a very important thing to state. And as we do get funding, which hopefully we will, we're going to try to be conscious about where that funding comes from, because we're ourselves talking about those issues.
So, can I ask a little bit about global trends? I mean, we talk a lot about hopefully a shift in the UK and Canada, but are there countries that are going in the right direction in terms of reducing their consumption of animals?
I think that's difficult for me to say right now. I'm not up to date on every single country and which country out there might be overall consuming less animal-based foods. I know that the government of China, for example, has stated that we want to reduce animal product consumption by 50% by what such and such year. But if you look at the trends in China, they're all increasing realistically in terms of their animal product consumption. Worldwide right now, I believe that overall we're in a bad place in that there's increasing trends of animal product consumption. The meat industries, relationships with government, with United Nations, IPCC, COP, are playing an important role in the future trajectory as well. But there's a lot of research that really shows the importance of transitioning away towards better plant-based foods. So we're going to all have to work together to try and reverse, to try and make a better trajectory. And I do believe that's possible. I don't want to say everything's dismal. I do believe it's possible, but we're going to have to work together and be really smart about it too.
Yeah. So just nipping back to something positive, which was obviously your wedding in India, but also thinking about what you said about soya milk and supplying it to areas that are, not doing well in terms of protein from other sources. I've heard you talk about Tetra Paks. And when you were talking about the soya milk, you said it's easy to import and easy to distribute. What's so bad about Tetra Paks? Is this something that we should be giving up, soya milk as a replacement? Should we be putting people straight onto the soya bean and avoiding the Tetra Pak altogether?
When it comes to global food and environmental impact, one of the biggest impacts that we don't talk about enough is packaging. This is for all types of foods, plant-based foods, juices, junk foods, animal products across the board. And again, 8 billion people consuming the amount of plastic and different types of packaging materials that we consume is devastating for the world. Tetra Paks are particularly bad because they have 4 or 5 layers of plastic bonded to paper, bonded to foil, bonded to another layer of plastic, and that's 4 layers, and there may be some more in there as well. Environmental packaging, because they say it's recyclable, but realistically, really in the world, most of it is not recycled. Okay, and it creates some of the worst types of pollution ever. But I'm also talking about other forms of plastic and other pollutions as well. Okay, that comes from food production. So if we're going to optimize a plant food system and have it just and ecological, we have to think about packaging. So to say something is plant-based or vegan by itself is not a slam dunk. Where does it come from? Is it chocolate that's coming from a slave trade in West Africa? Is it avocados from deforestation and gangs and human rights abuses in Mexico? We have to think about where that food comes from. We also have to think of how it's transported, packaged, and what is the waste product that's involved. And Tetra Paks are absolutely devastating. And most of the recycling systems are a hoax. They're kind of they don't actually recycle most of the things that you put into recycling. And that is true for most developed countries, actually, especially here in Canada and North America. What we need to do is reduce and use reusable containers. So it's imperative that we're all thinking about how to repackage our plant-based foods and things like soy milk as well. So I would love to see research done in developing countries to provide, let's say, fortified soy milk as one of the things that I'd love to see more widely used in all kinds of developing countries. And there are options of doing this with local production, providing fresh, fortified soy milk, same day produced and delivered, and tastes amazing when I've had the chance to have it produced from local machines that make this stuff, and tofu and things like that. That can be done very locally with minimal or no packaging, just going into people's existing containers and consumed the same day. You can have systems like this. You can have reusable containers as well that you bring and that get refilled, sterilized and refilled and so on. There's ways of doing this kind of stuff. Plant-based industry is not very interested and receptive to this message because they want to do the most expedient thing, which is to use conventional packaging methods that are already very systemized and scalable and cheap, artificially cheap, and keep doing this. So we'd like to see replacements of these methods. Now, in the meantime, do I buy packaged milk? Yes, I do. But as soon as I can find a replacement for it, promote or advocate for a systemic change, I'm all for it. And it may be an intermediate step where you have, like right now, dairy milk comes in these plastic milk bags in Canada, but the soy milk comes in boxes, not Tetra Paks, but most commonly comes in these boxes, these cardboard boxes, which again employ many layers in them, and maybe not as bad as Tetra Paks, but still pretty bad. But as soon as you might see, like, why wouldn't they make the soy milk into the regular milk plastic bags, which have less of an impact than the boxes and would be cheaper as well, actually. So why wouldn't we see that transition? And when can we see a transition to reusable packaging as well? My family in India, many of them, they drink dairy milk, and every day somebody comes to their door and pours it from their container into my family's container. And a friend of mine briefly had a small local soy milk business that used to do the same thing. So I'd love to see versions of this happen in developing countries where they fortify the soy milk with B12 and calcium at the same time. And in fact, there's one organization, I think it's called Malnutrition Matters. They do local soy milk projects in different countries where they make fresh soy milk. And another thing that would be really, really important for the Global South is having nutrition studies where you go to some place that is food insecure and provide good plant-based alternatives like a fortified soy milk every day, and provide a certain amount to kids in the area and measure their growth and health and see impacts in those things as well. So it's very interesting that the United Nations talks about improving their food security, while at the same time, overall, right now, this is a great matter of food injustice. Animal foods play a great role in their food injustice right now. So the same thing which is causing their injustice, you're going to export it back to them or something like that. I don't know how you're going to give it back, because you're already sucking the maximum out of them that you can to provide meat in developed countries and rich countries. So they're not taking these big picture realistic problems into consideration. But I would love for people in the plant-based movement to think about doing nutrition studies with optimized plant-based foods that are culturally appropriate in the Global South and see outcomes. So then we can look at that data and then promote, best case solutions for the Global South.
Mm. Right. I'm just going to pause there and sort of reflect on the fact that you're obviously an expert in this whole ecology of sustainable diets. And it's something that, I don't know if I'm speaking for Daisy here, but I probably am. It's not something that we talk to patients about. Now, you are also a clinician. Do you find that there's ever a place for bringing this up in a consultation? And if there is, what do you think patients might be most receptive to if we are going to put any comments in about some of these, ecological horrors, the eco-genocide, or what? Is there anything you particularly avoid talking about because they're going to be very resistant to it?
I think when it comes to patient interaction, I used to do family practice. I think that's what you guys do too. And I used to do some addictions work as well. But nowadays, my work is all focused on emergency medicine, or I think A&E, you guys call it there, right? And so I'm just in that space. I don't have much of an opportunity to talk about diets with my patients. We're mostly talking about the matter at hand. And also, sometimes I do, but it's very brief. If I have somebody with diabetes and high cholesterol and I have cardiac disease, and I feel it's pretty much my duty to say, hey, listen, here's all the medications and referrals I'm making you to all the different specialists. But at the same time, please do take a look at a couple of are you interested? I just ask them if they're interested in dietary measures that could also help them. Most people say yes, and I provide them with a couple of quick resources that they can look up on their own. So that's the limit of what I really do in my clinical practice. I think if I was doing family practice, I would have more time with patients and discuss it more over subsequent visits. But in my personal clinical practice, I think I don't talk about global issues or food insecurity or environmental issues to my patients in that respect. I mostly just talk about what's going to be beneficial for them. It's I haven't wrapped my head around it completely. So I'm not an expert in terms of how to talk to patients about this, or what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to talk to a patient about. But for now, I think my practice would be just to talk about what benefits the patient themselves and make the patient encounter about what's best for them, and not necessarily talk about environmental issues unless it affects them. For example, I want them to experience nature more, and that's going to be better for their health. So where can you experience nature more, yourself? But I'm not going to get into, I think, politics of it or preserving nature with them. I think there's a fine balance in it. I'm not saying that it's not right, but I just, for now, I think I personally don't know how I could do that without crossing a line that I shouldn't cross. I make it about the patient. And in my life and work and knowledge and skills that I have outside of the patient encounter, that's my space to do these things, right? And the knowledge and experience I gain from being a doctor can then be talked about in a broader way. I think that's my way right now.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because actually, we're all burning with a desire to talk about these issues. They're so important. But the one thing that we have is that captive audience in a consultation, and none of us will mention it, and that's how it is. That's the social norm, isn't it? That we do make it all about the individual patient in that consultation. I've got one final question for you, and it's coming back to the precision fermentation that you were so enthusiastic about earlier. Is that what you're using as a process for creating your dinner this evening?
My dinner, yeah. I'm not very good at sleeping enough, and I don't get enough exercise because of work and all these different things. I have a small baby too, but I am good with my food. So I'll tell you what we had last night. I don't know what's going on tonight, but last night we had like a homemade pizza with a multi-grain crust that my mom made this mix of flour with multiple grains, oat flour, a bit of soy flour, whole grain wheat flour, some millet flour, and I think she puts a bit of almond flour in there too. And so we use this for our rotis that we make, but we also used it for our pizza crust. And then we had a no cheese pizza. I don't even like plant-based cheese that much. It's not that healthy anyways. So sometimes I eat it, but not very often. We had a great pizza sauce with some tofurkey sausages, which are a low sodium and low saturated fat. They do not use coconut oil or palm oil in them, and plus a whole slew of different vegetables and mushrooms and loaded pizza, and it was pretty amazing. So we had that, and things like I have one of my favorite breakfasts, which I love to talk about, is I have this multi-grain organic cereal that's in a low plastic packaging as well, so it's not zero packaging, but a low packaging, and with soy milk, and then I put pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds and hemp seeds and ground flax seeds in there, and a lot of times some sliced banana in there, and it's so tasty. And my daughter, who's just turned 2 right now, for the past year, we've just been eating it together. We eat it from the same bowl together every morning, or most mornings, So it's a lot of fun, and super tasty and super healthy.
Great. And you're going to have to sit through what we're having for dinner now, which is
I'd love to hear.
Well, actually, we've already had dinner, I think. But Daisy, what did you have for dinner?
Can I deviate from the norm? And because just you've inspired me to tell you about no cheese pizza that I had yesterday, in fact, lunchtime. It's like a chain in London that does sourdough pizzas, sourdough base. And I never normally thought about having a no cheese pizza, but they had a vegan special. And it was just brilliant. You don't miss the cheese. The base was gorgeous. The tomato sauce was fresh. And they had like a walnut pesto thing fresh on top, which was gorgeous. Roast artichokes, caramelized onions. It was divine. It was, you don't miss the cheese at all. So I just wanted to share that because you said no cheese pizza. And I thought, that's the way forward.
When I went to Italy one time many years ago, I went to a pizza place that was really famous. And at lunchtime, there's a huge lineup of local people. And they only served a couple of two types of pizza, one margherita and one marinara. And people were buying marinara pizza and margherita pizza. And I learned in Italy that a lot of times the original pizzas didn't have cheese on them. They had really, really good tomato sauce and some other things on them, but they didn't always have pizza. So it's not even the original pizza was often without cheese anyways.
Exactly. Guilt-free pizza. That's what I call it. Both for my waistline and for the environment. Claire, what about you? What are you having for dinner?
Well, I think I might have talked about this one before, but it's like a hot poke bowl, although it didn't have a lot of things in it. I don't. It's just with some hot oat groats and some crispy fried tofu, and actually I had kale that was cooked in there as well, and then just a few like sort of pumpkin seeds and things, and then all dressed with tahini and some potato wedges on the side, amazingly, as tipped by Dr. Neil Barnard in his new power food book, where you make the wedges and you don't use oil, and they still taste really nice. And on the side, I haven't eaten any of them while we've been sitting here, but I had a whole bowl of padron peppers as well, where you put a bit of salt on them and just lightly fry them. So a sort of real nibble dinner.
Sounds
Yummy.
great.
Yummy.
Brilliant. Well, listen, we really wanted to give you a really big thank you. And yeah, it's been really fascinating. I feel like I have so much to learn and I've just scratched the surface. So we will definitely put all the links in the show notes for the listeners to go away and have a look at your website and read more about these very important issues. So thank you, Tushar.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and so good to connect. Hopefully I'll get to meet you guys in person if you visit here or when I'm in London next time.
That'd be lovely.